Okay, welcome back to Comparative Political Science. This is your second lecture. I'm going to lecture today on the book a little bit and your reading for the week. Um, let's start with the basics of the scientific method. You should remember from my first lecture I broke down a lot of the important stuff from the scientific method, but I wanted to give us a little bit more from our book on comparative politics by O'Neill. Because he's introducing some really important things, okay? So let's just start with the first chapter. What's most important in the first chapter is O'Neill is giving us some of the difficulties that comparative political scientists have to face when trying to use the scientific method to think about politics. I'm going to talk about each one of these just a little bit here. I have a longer example, but these are some important things. Okay, so one problem we have is difficulty controlling variables. What that means is difficulty keeping everything constant. For example, if we're looking at democracy, we can say, sure, some countries are democracies and some not, but then even within that democracy box, there's some big differences that could be just as important as democratic or non-democratic. Democratic countries do things differently, and so it's very difficult even to make comparisons, say, between the United States and England sometimes, because they're both democratic, but boy, they're doing their democracy differently. Secondly, we have a problem of multi-causality. There could be multiple things that are leading to an outcome, and it's hard to separate out which one is more important, where, when, and why. Okay, so we could take economic development perhaps as an example. Turns out there's lots of things that aid or hinder economic development. Things as diverse as political capacity, how developed is your state, educational systems, lots of things go into economic development. And which one is more important, where, when, and why, it's a bit difficult to know. Thirdly, information limits. It's just hard to get our information sometimes. I was reading some work recently from some comparativists who do work with African countries, and one of the biggest difficulties they have is just getting reliable information, even from the states, the governments in those countries themselves, okay? So, if we're looking at graduation rates and the government is manipulating the graduation rates, or maybe just not collecting them, or just doing a bad job, right? Government doesn't have to be purposefully manipulating things for this to be a problem. They're just doing a bad job. They're not counting properly. Well, we're in trouble, right? Because if we want to know about graduation rates, now what are we going to do? That's a tough one. Number of cases. One of the things that makes political science particularly difficult is we only have 200 countries in the world. It's 191, 192, something like that. So even just looking at how many things can we study, we have a very limited field for how many things we can study. If we were looking at trees, well, there's millions of trees on the planet, and it would make it a lot easier if we could, have that many different examples. Fifthly, in political science, and this holds true actually in many disciplines, we don't do a great job talking to each other. So for example, there's lots of people who study one country or an area, they're kind of area studies people, and they know Taiwan or China or Japan really deeply and intensely. And then there's someone else who maybe is just studying democracy worldwide, and he's got a big data set, he's running lots of statistics, etc. If those two guys aren't talking to each other, they're not doing a great job of sharing information, and it can throw both of their use of the scientific method off. So that's a tough one, institutional barriers. 6, there's various types of biases. So the one your book talks about is selection bias, which is only looking at cases where what we wanted to happen actually happened, and not looking at cases where it didn't happen. But this is really important. So for example, if we wanted to know what makes like a basketball team or a football team, what makes some kind of sports team a champion, right? What allows them to win the NBA Finals, the World Series, whatever it is? If we only looked at teams that won, we would only be looking at half of the information relevant to that question. And if we said, oh, teams that win always have, better batting average than teams that lose, if we only looked at teams that won, we might actually be missing a case where there was a team that had a better batting average and then actually lost the World Series, right? And then it'd be, oh, well, better batting average isn't the only thing that matters. Maybe we also need to look at pitching. Something like that, okay? And then finally, what political scientists call endogeneity. Endogeneity is, what if we have two things that are kind of, there we go, this way, mutually causing each other, right? How do we separate out which one is more important? This is actually a very difficult problem. Let me give you an example for, a good example for like the limits of this type of, for political scientists. So just sort of a good example. When I was in graduate school, I bought this, it was a late 80s BMW 3 Series convertible, and I really loved this car. Of course, I didn't buy the car until 2004 or something. So it was about 15 years old when I bought it. But it was beautiful. The owner had kept it nice. It didn't have too many miles on it. Man, I really love this car. Through time, it was super reliable. It started to break down a little bit. The interior started to get really bad, and someone kept the top one time, so that was annoying, and stole stuff from the inside. So it started to kind of crumble, but the engine kept going. The engine would not die. Occasionally it would have problems. And this one time it was having this problem in the morning where it wouldn't quite start up right, but once it got warm it would be fine. So I didn't know what to do because that's a really annoying problem. It's going to be at the mechanic forever. So finally it starts to get worse. I take it into the mechanic and I say, hey, what do you think? And this is what he says to me. He says, well, look, a car is a complex system. There are a lot of things that could be causing this problem. And so what I'm going to have to do is try to troubleshoot this one the old-fashioned way. Each morning, I'm going to keep swapping out one part until it's fixed, and then I'll know what the problem was. Right? That's truly the old-fashioned way, right? Just trial and error, just trial and error. But you know what? That's good science if we can control our variables. And this is, this is the moral here, right? To a political scientist, being able to do what my mechanic did is a complete luxury, right? We wish we could just swap parts in and out and then turn her on and see what happens. But you can't rerun elections, right? Just think of that so simply. You can't rerun elections, and even if you could, the context would be so completely different. We're going to think about Barack Obama's first election, perhaps. The context there was so important. Bush, people were really tired of Bush. Obama was like, wow, this breath of fresh air. If Obama ran, maybe hypothesize he had lost 8 years ago, maybe Clinton won. If Obama was running now, it would be a much different election, just like Hillary's now running again, right? So but look at what a completely different election it is. Everything's changed. The whole political landscape has changed. Hillary's a different candidate, actually interesting. She seems to be a bit better, really sort of on point now, and she was a little bit struggling 8 years ago. Anyways, doesn't matter. But think about what a luxury that is. Boy, political scientists wish we could rerun elections. That would be great. That would be like such a fantasy dream for us, okay? So, we don't have that luxury. Like engines, political systems are highly complex. There's no doubt about that. Unlike engines, we can't swap parts in and out, control our variables, or wait a day and assume nothing else will change. Boy, we wish we could do that, okay? So there's some real limits to science. The state. So that's really what I want you to get from the first chapter is some of the problems of doing science, okay? Chapter 2 is focused on the state. The state is one of the central categories in political science. Frequently in common speech we say the government, but a political scientist will draw a distinction between the state and the government, which looks like this. Well, you see in your books you have regime, state, government, okay? Is that right? Is that how it is? I'll get there in a second. So, but the state is not Barack Obama's particular administration. That's what we would call the government. The state is that part of the government that will be there, whether it's Obama or Bush or whoever else, okay? This is Max Weber's definition. Max Weber is one of the most important comparative political scientists of all time. So you see him come up in this book a lot. Really set the terms for a lot of comparative study of politics. German dude, died almost exactly 100 years ago. He died in the flu, the influenza outbreak. I think it was 1918 or 19, maybe early 20s. So a little bit less than 100 years ago. Max Weber's definition is the state is a monopoly of violence over a given territory, right? So this brings up two things that are really important about the state. One, the state gets to use violence and you don't get to, right? Didn't used to be this way, say like 1,000 years ago necessarily. Think feudalism, boy, people were allowed to use violence and you had all these different systems of when and where and why. Nowadays it's real simple. Police, military, all of that, it's done by the central organization we call the state, and you're not allowed to use violence except in protection of yourself. The state is also an institution designed to carry out public policy. Public policy is just any rule or regulation that affects sort of everybody. So trade, education, welfare, military, all of these things are matters of public policy. The state is also what we call sovereign, meaning the highest in the land. So, there's no authority higher than the state, no matter what Hebrew National says. They say they had the old commercial. We answer to a higher authority. The state recognizes no higher authority. It is the final decider. And the state has big powers, right? Think military and taxes. Wherever you see military and taxes, you see the state. But also education, judiciary, etc. State, regime, government. See the chart on page 32. That's what I was going for. So state is you actually have that thing there. Regime choice is democratic versus authoritarian. And then government is who's actually leading the regime right now, right? Who's actually running the state right now. So the United States, well, we have a state. We call it the state. Our regime is democratic, and our government is democratic, headed by Barack Obama. If Trump or Bush or one of the Republican candidates win, we would have a change of government, but not a change of regime or state. Okay, but let's also think a little bit more intensely now, such the basics of what the state is. Let's think about how states vary and some of the sort of conceptual apparatus we need for thinking about how states, how to construct states and think about them. Max Weber also thought very intensely about how states come to be seen as legitimate being appropriate or correct for the sort of purpose at hand. Okay, so that's all we mean by legitimacy. And Max Weber defined 3 types of legitimacy that states and other institutions use in order to make themselves as being seen right or proper, These 3 types of legitimacy are traditional, charismatic, and rational legal. This is a hugely important part of Max Weber's political theory, political science. Traditional legitimacy is things the way they've always been, very ritualized. This type of legitimacy is very common in religious institutions, also ethnic traditions. So if you do, styles of native ethnic dance, right? These are sort of traditions. And why do we do them this way? Because we've always done them this way. Traditions do change, but they're relatively stable through time. So they'll kind of modify a little bit, but you can track them back, okay? Charismatic legitimacy is the power of personality, right? Think Barack Obama certainly had some charismatic legitimacy, at least when he first got elected. Maybe people are a little over it now. That's up to you. But wow, when he was first elected, there's this real sort of sense of the power of his personality and how it sort of moved people, okay? Max Weber calls this the gift of grace. And he is thinking very specifically here about sort of religious sort of orientation. But the gift of grace is the feeling that a person has a special quality that makes them worthy of being followed. Okay, we might even say great sports stars have charisma. So do movie stars, politicians, right? Charisma, it's that, special something that really makes you want to do what somebody says. And then also religious prophets. And then rational legal legitimacy, type of legitimacy that comes from having settled rules and regulations. And so something, you have a settled rule and regulation, and that gives it a kind of legitimacy. Think of courts, right? Legal courts, the legitimacy of precedents, of having laws that have been there for a long time, and then we keep applying them to new cases. Let's take an example. So one thing we need to be really clear about is that these three types of legitimacy, it's not like you only pick one and you don't get to do the other one. You get to do all three. Will be found in any social scenario or situation, right? So, if you're enjoying my lecture, there might be some charismatic legitimacy there. You say, wow, Professor Selby, he's, really interesting, and so I want to do better in political science because, wow, the power of his personality is motivating me. Or you might look at rational legal legitimacy. Well, the professor has been designated by the state, right? They have rules and regulations for who gets to be a professor. You have to get hired. All of these things are rational legal types of legitimacy. And so maybe you might not be as motivated to do well, but you recognize that those rules and regulations sort of approve me, if you will, for being appropriate to the position of teaching political science class. Someone who's charismatic but doesn't have the same set of qualifications that I do might not be appropriate to teach political science class. They may still be very charismatic, but you need the other one. And then also think about traditional legitimacy. Think about the classroom setting, right? Sadly, we're not in a classroom here, but I usually pick up on that when I'm teaching this in person. And we talk about, well, you learn what it means to go to school from the time that you're very little, and you sit in your rows, and you only talk when professor asks questions, and this type of thing, right? That's a traditional legitimacy, which is different. All three are there in any educational scenario. Let's take a look at the Catholic Church. Well, your first thought with any religious institution should be traditional legitimacy, right? And sure enough, there's a lot of that in any church, including the Catholic Church. Notice the ritualization of something like going to Mass. You do it because your parents did it because their parents did it. It's being passed down from time immemorial. It's highly ritualized, and you learn it in that ritualized setting. So that's a traditional kind of legitimacy. But there's a lot of charisma as well in the Catholic Church. Think about the current Pope. I'm not Catholic. The current Pope, Pope Francis. He's getting a lot of news. People are really inspired by him. They're saying, wow, he's such a dynamic person, yada yada. Bringing even some people back into the Catholic Church has been happening. So this is type of charismatic legitimacy. And sure enough, according to official Catholic doctrine, the Pope is literally the representative of Christ on earth. He is literally in between humanity and the divine, the gift of grace that Max Weber was talking about. He was really thinking about the Catholic Church when he was thinking about charismatic legitimacy. And sure enough, lots of popes have this sort of larger-than-life personality. They're more than just religious figures. They talk about world peace and all these other things. And for another example of a very charismatic pope, think of John Paul II, who was the pope in the 80s and 90s. He was known as the youth pope, and would go to South America, and hundreds of thousands of people there going to see him speak. Any pope gets a big crowd, but John Paul II had bigger crowds, more enthusiastic crowds, very intense. And then finally, you might not realize this, but the Catholic Church writes a lot of its laws down. In fact, it writes all of them down, okay? So it has this element of rational legal legitimacy that's very important. Anytime the Pope says, this is now a part of church doctrine, it gets written down. And by writing it down, it starts to get some rational legal legitimacy. It's then incorporated into, the big book of Catholic laws, etc. I don't think that's its technical name. So, think about it this way even. The Catholic Church even has courts, just like regular state does. They're called ecclesiastical courts, means like religious court. And they don't use them as frequently anymore, but if you are a priest and you write something that seems a little bit out of line with traditional Catholic doctrine, you might have to go in front of a court, or you do something actually illegal or something against the rules of the church, then you might end up in an ecclesiastic court. Okay, so that's rational legal legitimacy, right? And then, the other thing to keep in mind here, where does the Pope come from? Well, the Pope is elected. There's a set of rules that determine how the Pope gets elected. He's elected by what's called the College of Cardinals. And those election procedures are rational legal procedures, right? They have their validity, maybe partially traditionally because we've been doing things this way, so the rational legal procedure can have a kind of traditional underpinning, but it itself is a rational legal type of procedure. Well, let's think about how this really affects politics, because interestingly it does. Presidential democracies, and Max Weber understood this, they tend to have more charismatic authority than parliamentary democracies. Why? Because presidents are directly elected by the people. Just like the Pope has that kind of direct connection to Jesus Christ, presidents have a direct connection to the people. They draw their support, legitimacy directly from the people. And we could think of the people in this case as almost like the God of a democratic political unit, for the people, by the people, right? The end of all things. So presidents get their blah, blah, blah. Presidents don't have to compromise with members of their own party. They get to do, according to their own judgment, right? They can be very independent, mavericky, go their own way, and all of those things are charismatic qualities, right? Think of the great U.S. presidents, JFK, FDR, Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan. The great communicator, right? Actually, Reagan's a perfect example here. The great communicator. When he talked, people felt like they wanted to follow him. The other option is parliamentary democracy, which is more like England. You want to pay attention to my Rules That Matter lecture here, which is also up online. So if you're a little confused about the presidential parliamentarism here, that's okay. Go to my Rules That Matter lecture and it'll hopefully make more sense. Prime ministers and parliamentary systems of democratic governance tend to have a little bit more rational legal legitimacy. Why? Well, prime ministers only become prime ministers because they get voted on it by members of their own party, which means they have to be nice, good party players. Prime ministers have to compromise with other people. They don't get to go independent and be mavericky. They actually have to kind of be team players. That means managing everybody's personalities and all of that. And that's a much more rational, legal way of doing politics, of doing governance. So notice, right, one part of state variation here is going to be charisma. Do your political institutions leave a lot of space for charisma, like presidentialism, especially in the United States, or a little space for charisma? Make no mistake, prime ministers can still be very charismatic. Tony Blair was a good example of this. Trudeau, if you're following Canadian politics, they just elected a new prime minister. Trudeau, he seems to be pretty charismatic. It's not that prime ministers aren't charismatic, but the institutional choice opens up more space for charisma by making presidents independent, or less space for charisma by making presidents dependent upon their friends in their political party. Okay, second element of state variation here that's pretty important, what we call autonomy and capacity. This is pretty quick and simple. These first readings, I don't think they're too tough. I hope you guys do okay. But autonomy is the ability of states to be independent from groups in civil society. So if the state can get nothing done without checking with somebody first, whether it's a business or a religious group or an ethnic group or whatever, then it's lacking in autonomy, right? So if you think that the big problem with American politics today is that businesses have too much power, what you're saying, the United States is not sufficient. The United States government is not sufficiently autonomous from the business interests that are able to tell it what to do. That's what you're saying. Now, as another factual matter, we don't want states that are completely autonomous. States that are completely autonomous, or mostly completely autonomous, tend to do things like use lots of violence upon their populations, right? Being autonomous is not always a good thing. But not having any autonomy and being sort of beholden to certain groups out there in society, also a problem. So this is kind of a middle ground one. The second factor here we want to be looking at is state capacity. And state capacity is very simply how much can your state get done, right? So one measurement of state capacity is how much money do you bring into your treasury every year, right? It's a very clear, direct sort of where the rubber hits the road. How many tanks do you have? Another measure of state capacity. A state that has no army and cannot raise taxes lacks in capacity, right? States through time, their capacity tends to increase relatively constantly. So it doesn't matter what state you are, United States, France, Germany, whatever, they tend to raise taxes little by little each year, 0.25% kind of thing. The size of armies varies a lot, but they tend to do more and more and more through time. And that's it. So that's the end of my lecture here on chapter 1 and 2 of Essentials of Comparative Politics. And don't forget to get online and do your participation.